That's not what the contract actually says. The sentence was quiet, almost careful, yet it cut through the polished silence of the conference room like a thread pulled tight across glass. For a second, no one reacted. The 42nd floor of the Whitmore Financial Tower overlooked the entire downtown skyline, a field of steel and sunlight stretching miles toward the river, and inside the room a 12-foot walnut table was surrounded by lawyers in tailored suits, analysts with open laptops, and two executives who had flown in from overseas for what was supposed to be a routine negotiation. At the head of the table sat Richard Whitmore, the billionaire founder whose reputation in the investment world was almost mythic. He had built an empire moving money across continents the way other men moved chess pieces. Moments earlier he had leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and spoken a sentence in fluent Arabic while reviewing a section of the contract projected onto the screen. The room had stayed silent. None of his senior attorneys responded. None of the translators spoke. A faint smile had formed on Whitmore's face as if he had just confirmed something he already suspected. Then the quiet voice came from the far end of the room, near the door where a service cart stood beside the wall. Heads slowly turned. Standing there in a dark housekeeping uniform was a young black woman holding a silver tray with 4 untouched glasses of water. She looked no older than 27, her posture straight but calm, the kind of posture someone learns after long hours working in buildings where people rarely look twice at the staff who keep everything running. For a moment nobody spoke because the situation didn't fit into any familiar category. A maid was not supposed to interrupt a 9-figure negotiation. One of the visiting executives blinked as if he had misheard something. Another man near the middle of the table let out a small, incredulous laugh. Richard Whitmore didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying the woman across the room as if he were trying to place a detail that didn't belong in the picture. "What did you say?" he asked slowly. The young woman didn't step forward, and she didn't shrink back either. She simply set the tray down on the edge of a nearby cabinet and answered in the same measured tone. "The Arabic wording you just used shifts the liability clause to the signing party. The English version on the screen doesn't reflect that." Several people glanced immediately toward the projected document, then back at her again. The translator sitting 2 seats away from Whitmore stiffened, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. A lawyer near the corner of the table leaned toward his colleague and whispered something under his breath. The maid folded her hands loosely in front of her uniform apron, waiting. Sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows cast a long stripe across the conference table, catching the edge of the contract text glowing on the wall. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood as he looked directly at her now, not past her like before, but at her, the way a strategist studies an unexpected move on the board. The room had gone completely silent again, except this time the silence felt different, heavier somehow, like the air had shifted pressure. Because the woman standing by the door had not spoken by accident, and everyone in that room could feel it. For a few seconds no one in the room moved. The lawyers stared at the contract projected on the wall, then back at the woman standing quietly near the door. She did not look nervous. She did not look proud either. She simply waited as if she had already said everything that needed to be said. Richard Whitmore watched her carefully. In 25 years of negotiations he had learned to recognize the difference between confidence and guessing, and the woman in the housekeeping uniform did not look like someone guessing. One of the attorneys finally cleared his throat. "Sir," he said cautiously, glancing between Whitmore and the contract. "The Arabic phrasing she mentioned, we should verify it." Another executive leaned back in his chair with a faint smile that suggested amusement more than concern. "Verify it with who?" he asked. "With the housekeeping staff?" A few quiet chuckles moved around the table, the kind of polite laughter people offer when they assume a moment is ridiculous. The woman did not react to the laughter. She stood still beside the cabinet, her dark hair pulled neatly into a low bun, her housekeeping badge clipped to the front of her uniform where the name A.V.A. Carter was printed in small black letters. She looked like she belonged exactly where she was standing, which somehow made the moment even stranger. The translator seated near the middle of the table shifted uncomfortably and began typing quickly on his laptop. His brow tightened as he reread the Arabic clause line by line. Across the room, one of the visiting executives from the investment firm leaned toward the screen and narrowed his eyes, following the sentence with his finger. Read the Arabic version again, Whitmore said quietly. His voice carried across the table without needing to be raised. The translator hesitated before speaking, then slowly repeated the Arabic phrase that Whitmore had used earlier. Ava listened without interrupting. When he finished, she spoke again, her voice calm and precise. The verb tense changes the obligation. It means the signing party assumes the financial exposure if the partnership fails. The translator stopped typing. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the building ventilation system. Sunlight continued sliding across the polished conference table, reflecting in the glass walls behind them. Whitmore leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together, studying her expression the way a professor studies a student who has just challenged the answer key. "You understand Arabic?" he asked. Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." "And you learned that where exactly?" he continued. She paused for a moment before answering, as if measuring how much explanation was necessary. "My father worked overseas when I was growing up," she said. "We lived in Abu Dhabi for several years." The statement landed in the room with unexpected weight. A junior analyst looked up from his tablet in surprise. One of the visiting executives straightened in his chair. The translator slowly closed his laptop halfway, his earlier confidence fading into uncertainty. Whitmore remained silent for several seconds. He was not smiling anymore. Instead, he seemed to be examining the moment from every angle, like a man trying to determine whether an unexpected move was a mistake or the beginning of a very different game. Finally, he gestured toward the contract displayed on the screen. "Then explain the clause," he said calmly. Ava stepped away from the cabinet and walked closer to the table, not hurriedly and not timidly, simply with the steady pace of someone who had already decided she belonged in the conversation. Ava Carter stopped a few feet from the edge of the conference table, close enough now that everyone in the room could see the calm focus in her eyes. The polished surface reflected the light from the windows behind her, casting a faint glow across the printed pages of the contract spread in front of the attorneys. No one offered her a chair. No one invited her to sit. She remained standing, hands loosely at her sides, her housekeeping badge catching a small flash of sunlight as she looked toward the projection on the wall. Richard Whitmore watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, but his attention fully fixed on her now. Around the table, several executives exchanged quiet glances, still uncertain whether this moment was an interruption or the beginning of something far more unusual. Ava lifted her hand slightly and gestured toward the Arabic sentence displayed on the screen. "The issue begins with the verb in the third line," she said calmly. In English, the translation says the liability may be shared between both parties depending on the outcome of the project. But the Arabic wording does not say may. It says will. The translator shifted in his chair, his fingers resting on the edge of his keyboard. Ava continued, her voice steady and measured so every word carried clearly across the room. That single verb changes the entire legal structure of the agreement. If the partnership fails, the signing party becomes fully responsible for the financial exposure. That includes operational losses, contractual penalties, and the debt obligations tied to the development phase. One of the visiting executives leaned forward sharply. "Are you saying our firm would assume all of that risk?" Ava nodded slightly. "Yes, sir. According to the Arabic wording, the responsibility transfers completely after the contract is signed." The room grew quieter with every sentence she spoke. Several lawyers began flipping through printed copies of the document, tracing the lines with their pens. The translator opened his laptop again and began typing quickly, cross-checking the Arabic text with another source. Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as he watched the exchange unfold. His eyes moved from the screen to Ava and then to the attorneys studying the contract in front of them. One of the senior lawyers adjusted his glasses and spoke slowly. If that interpretation is correct, the exposure could reach hundreds of millions of dollars over the first 5 years. The visiting executives exchanged alarmed looks. Ava remained composed. "That is correct," she said. "Approximately $300 million based on the projected capital structure outlined in Section 8. Several heads turned toward her again, surprise replacing the earlier skepticism. The figure was precise. It matched the internal projections that only the legal and finance teams had reviewed earlier that morning. The translator finally stopped typing and stared at the screen in silence. His shoulders lowered slightly as the realization settled in. One of the analysts whispered something to the colleague beside him, but the words faded quickly into the thick quiet surrounding the table. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned forward again, resting his hands on the polished wood. For the first time since the meeting had begun, there was no trace of amusement in his expression. He looked directly at Ava Carter, as if reevaluating every assumption he had made the moment he noticed the housekeeping uniform near the door. "You calculated that exposure already?" he asked. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. "Because that clause does not protect the partner. It traps them." The words settled over the room like a weight, and no one laughed this time. The words lingered in the air long after Ava finished speaking. Around the conference table, the quiet tension began to shift into something heavier, something that carried the unmistakable weight of realization. Several attorneys leaned closer to their documents, flipping through the pages with growing urgency. Pens traced the lines of text again and again, as if the meaning might change if they read it enough times. The translator reopened his laptop fully now, pulling up multiple references, his fingers moving faster across the keyboard. The faint clicking sound echoed softly in the silent room. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his posture straight and composed, but his attention had narrowed entirely onto the woman standing across from him. The polished floor reflected the bright afternoon sunlight that poured through the wall of glass behind them, stretching long rectangles of light beneath the chairs. Ava Carter stood calmly in the center of that light, her housekeeping uniform still unmistakable, yet somehow the least important detail about her now. One of the visiting executives finally broke the silence. $300 million, he repeated slowly, his voice carrying disbelief. "You are certain about that figure?" Ava nodded once. "Based on the projected capital investment schedule in Section 8 and the operational liability defined in Section 14, yes, sir." The senior attorney closest to Whitmore adjusted his glasses again and exhaled quietly. "If the Arabic clause stands as written, then she is correct," he said carefully. "The exposure would transfer entirely to the partner firm." Another lawyer spoke up from the opposite side of the table. "And if the project were to collapse during the development phase, the signing party would carry the debt obligation alone." A low murmur moved across the room. The executives from the visiting firm exchanged tense looks, their earlier confidence fading into concern. One of them leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the screen as if seeing the contract for the first time. The translator finally stopped typing and looked up, his face noticeably pale. "The translation on the screen is inaccurate," he admitted quietly. "The Arabic verb structure confirms what she explained." A stillness followed that statement, thicker than the silence before. Richard Whitmore lowered his gaze to the printed copy of the agreement in front of him, then lifted his eyes back to Ava Carter. The difference in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. The dismissive curiosity from earlier had disappeared, replaced by something closer to focused respect. "You identified this from hearing one sentence?" he asked. Ava gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." One of the junior analysts near the middle of the table leaned forward, studying her with open curiosity. "You read the rest of the contract too?" he asked before catching himself and glancing nervously toward Whitmore. Ava hesitated briefly, then answered honestly. "While I was setting the water on the table earlier, the document was already on the screen. I recognized the terminology." The analyst blinked in surprise. The document had been visible for less than 2 minutes before the meeting began. Whitmore slowly stood from his chair, the movement quiet but commanding enough that every conversation stopped immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Ava as he walked a few steps along the edge of the table, stopping closer to where she stood. The city skyline behind him shimmered through the glass walls, but no one in the room seemed aware of it anymore. "Tell me something, Miss Carter," he said calmly. "If you recognize the trap in the wording that quickly, why did you decide to speak now?" Ava met his eyes without lowering her gaze. "Because if no one said anything," she replied softly, "someone was about to sign it." The answer settled over the conference room like a quiet verdict. For several seconds no one spoke. The executives from the visiting firm sat perfectly still, their attention fixed on the woman who had just explained a flaw that could have cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. The attorneys exchanged glances again, but this time the looks carried something different than skepticism. It was the uneasy recognition that someone outside the circle had seen what they had missed. Richard Whitmore studied Ava Carter for a long moment before responding. His posture remained calm, but the intensity in his eyes had sharpened. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this is a private negotiation involving a very large financial agreement." Ava nodded. "Yes, sir. And you chose to interrupt the meeting anyway." His voice was not angry, but the weight of the statement was clear. Every person in the room knew that employees and the service staff normally avoided even speaking in a meeting like this, let alone correcting a legal clause. Ava kept her shoulders straight. "Yes, sir," she said again. The quiet confidence in her tone drew the attention of everyone at the table. One of the visiting executives leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together as he studied her. "You may have just prevented a serious mistake," he said carefully, "but you also placed yourself in the middle of a negotiation that you were not part of." Another executive gave a faint nod in agreement. The translator shifted in his chair again, clearly uncomfortable as the focus of the room moved further away from him and toward the woman in the housekeeping uniform. Richard Whitmore took a few steps along the side of the table, stopping just a few feet from where Ava stood. Through the glass wall behind him, the afternoon sun hung above the skyline, reflecting off the river several miles away. Inside the room, the atmosphere had become thick with tension. "Tell me something else, Miss Carter," Whitmore said calmly. "When you recognized the problem in the contract, did you consider staying silent?" Ava paused briefly before answering. It was the first moment since she spoke that she seemed to think carefully about her words. "Yes, sir," she said honestly. A few people at the table shifted in their seats. "Then why did you speak?" he asked. Ava glanced once toward the screen displaying the contract and then back at Whitmore. "Because the clause was written clearly," she said. "Anyone who understands the language could see it." One of the attorneys raised an eyebrow slightly, intrigued by the simplicity of the answer. Whitmore watched her without blinking. "That does not answer my question," he said. Ava took a slow breath, not nervously but thoughtfully. "I spoke because if the agreement had been signed the way it was written," she said quietly, "someone would have carried the loss." The room fell silent again. One of the visiting executives leaned back in his chair, clearly absorbing the implication. Ava continued in the same calm tone. "And if I had understood the problem and said nothing, then the loss would not have been an accident. It would have been a choice." The statement hung in the air, simple and direct. Richard Whitmore's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, as if the conversation had moved into deeper territory than contracts and translations. Around the table, several of the attorneys slowly lowered their pens, realizing that the moment unfolding in the room was no longer only about a legal clause. It was about the unexpected voice that had refused to stay silent. The silence that followed felt deeper than before, as if the entire room had stepped into a pause that no one wanted to break too quickly. Outside the glass wall, the afternoon sun had begun to drift lower across the skyline, casting long reflections across the river and turning the windows of nearby buildings into sheets of pale gold. Inside the conference room, the air felt unusually still. Richard Whitmore remained standing near the edge of the table, his gaze resting on Ava Carter with the focused patience of a man reconsidering something important. Around them, the attorneys and executives had grown quiet, no longer whispering to one another or scanning their documents. The conversation had moved beyond the contract itself. Ava stood calmly where she was, her hands resting loosely at her sides. The housekeeping cart still waited near the door where she had left it earlier, a quiet reminder of the role she had been performing only minutes before. Yet the room no longer saw her the same way. One of the visiting executives slowly leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window for a moment before speaking softly. $300 million, he repeated again, but this time the number sounded less like disbelief and more like reflection. The senior attorney beside him closed his folder and placed his pen down on the table, signaling that the legal discussion had reached a pause. Richard Whitmore finally broke the quiet. "You made a choice," he said evenly, his voice calm but thoughtful. Ava met his eyes. "Yes, sir." Whitmore nodded once, almost to himself. "Most people in this building would not have done that," he continued. "Not in this room. Not in this situation." Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the screen where the contract still glowed in pale blue text against the dark background. The legal language now looked less like a routine agreement and more like a puzzle that had nearly trapped the wrong people. I do not think it was a difficult choice, she said gently. One of the attorneys raised an eyebrow at that statement. You do not, he asked. Ava shook her head slightly. No, sir. It was simply the honest one. The words settled quietly over the table. Richard Whitmore studied her expression carefully, searching for any hint of exaggeration or performance, but he found none. Her voice carried no pride and no fear, only certainty. He walked slowly back toward his chair, but did not sit down immediately. Instead, he rested his hands on the back of it and looked around the table at the executives and attorneys who had gathered there. We spend a great deal of time in rooms like this, he said thoughtfully, analyzing numbers, reviewing clauses, calculating risk. Several of the lawyers nodded slightly. Whitmore then looked back toward Ava. And yet the most important decision in this room today was not made by the people whose names are on this contract. The room fell quiet again. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, not in embarrassment, but in simple humility. The sunlight continued to shift across the polished table, slowly inching toward the stack of documents in front of Whitmore. After a moment, he straightened his posture and spoke again, this time with a different tone. Miss Carter, he said, before we continue this meeting, I believe everyone here would like to understand something. Ava looked up again. Yes, sir. Whitmore gestured lightly toward the chair beside the conference table. How exactly does a person who understands Arabic legal terminology end up pushing a housekeeping cart through my building? For a moment, Ava Carter did not answer. The question seemed simple on the surface, yet everyone in the room sensed that the story behind it would not be simple at all. The conference room remained quiet except for the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic far below the tower. Ava glanced briefly toward the housekeeping cart near the door, then back at Richard Whitmore. The sunlight that had been moving slowly across the table now rested along the edge of the contract documents, lighting the printed pages with a warm glow. She took a small breath before speaking. My father worked in construction projects across the Middle East for many years, she said calmly. When I was a child, we lived in Abu Dhabi for almost 7 years. A few people around the table shifted slightly in their chairs, listening more closely now. Ava continued in the same steady tone. While we lived there, I attended a local international school. Arabic was required in the program, and my father believed that learning the language would open doors later in life. He used to say that understanding a language means understanding how people think. Richard Whitmore listened without interrupting. The executives at the table watched her as well, the earlier disbelief gradually transforming into curiosity. Ava folded her hands lightly in front of her as she continued. When we moved back to the United States, I enrolled in college and studied international economics. My goal was to work in global investment analysis, especially projects connected to Middle Eastern development funds. One of the junior analysts at the table looked surprised. That path was remarkably close to the type of work being discussed in the very meeting she had interrupted. Ava paused for a moment, choosing her next words carefully. During my final year, my father became ill, she said quietly. He had spent most of his life working physically demanding jobs overseas. When his health declined, he could no longer travel or work the way he used to. The room grew still again. Ava's voice remained composed but softer now. Medical bills began to accumulate quickly. I left school before completing my final semester so I could work full-time and help support my parents. One of the attorneys lowered his eyes toward the table, recognizing the familiar story that so many families quietly carry. Ava glanced toward the window briefly, as if recalling the long months that followed. At first, I believed the break from school would only be temporary, she said. But life has a way of moving forward whether we are ready or not. The faintest smile crossed her face, not bitter but reflective. Eventually, I needed a job that would provide steady hours and health benefits. The housekeeping department here offered both. Richard Whitmore watched her carefully as she spoke, absorbing each piece of the story. Around the table, the executives who had once laughed at the interruption now sat in thoughtful silence. Ava finished simply. So I took the position. I told myself that someday I might return to finish my degree. The quiet that followed felt different from the earlier tension. It was no longer the silence of doubt or suspicion. It was the silence of understanding. Richard Whitmore slowly nodded, as if a complex picture had finally come into focus. The quiet understanding in the room lingered for several seconds after Ava finished speaking. The executives around the table no longer looked at her with curiosity alone. There was something closer to respect in their expressions now, mixed with a faint sense of discomfort. Not because of anything she had done wrong, but because they were beginning to realize how easily someone with her knowledge had been overlooked. Richard Whitmore remained standing beside his chair, his eyes resting on Ava Carter as if he were carefully measuring every detail of what she had just explained. The skyline outside the glass wall had begun to soften into late afternoon light, the reflections across the river turning warmer as the sun moved lower in the sky. Inside the room, the contract still glowed quietly on the screen, the legal language frozen exactly where the mistake had nearly changed everything. Whitmore slowly walked back toward the head of the table and finally sat down. His fingers rested lightly on the polished wood as he looked around the room at the attorneys, translators, and executives who had gathered there for what had once been a routine negotiation. "It seems," he said calmly, "that today we almost signed an agreement none of us fully understood." No one rushed to respond. The senior attorney cleared his throat softly but remained silent, acknowledging the truth of the statement without trying to defend it. Whitmore turned his attention back to Ava. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone steady but noticeably different than it had been earlier. "How long have you been working in this building?" Ava answered without hesitation. 2 years, sir." Whitmore nodded slowly. "And during those 2 years, no one here has asked you about your background?" A faint, thoughtful smile appeared on Ava's face. "No, sir," she replied gently. The simplicity of the answer carried more meaning than any long explanation could have. One of the visiting executives leaned forward again, studying her with open interest. "If you were still working in international analysis," he said carefully, "would you have approached a contract like this the same way you did today?" Ava considered the question for a moment. "Yes, sir," she said. "The language of risk does not change just because the room changes." A quiet murmur of agreement moved around the table. Richard Whitmore remained silent for several seconds after that. Then he reached forward and closed the printed copy of the contract in front of him. The soft sound of the pages folding together echoed gently in the quiet room. "This meeting will not continue today," he said firmly. The attorneys looked up immediately, surprised but attentive. Whitmore gestured toward the screen. "That agreement will be rewritten with accurate language before any signatures are considered." The visiting executives exchanged relieved glances. Whitmore then turned his chair slightly, so he faced Ava directly. The room seemed to pause again, as everyone sensed that the next words would matter. "Miss Carter," he said evenly, "earlier today you pushed a housekeeping card into this room." Ava nodded once. Whitmore continued, his voice calm but unmistakably decisive. "Tomorrow morning, I would like you to walk into this building through the front entrance instead." Several people at the table looked up in surprise. Whitmore held Ava's gaze as he finished the sentence. "And I would like you to join my legal and analysis team for a conversation about where your skills truly belong." For several seconds after Richard Whitmore finished speaking, the room remained completely silent. The executives around the conference table looked from Whitmore to Ava Carter and back again, as if the moment had shifted the balance of the entire meeting in a way none of them had expected when the day began. Outside the towering glass windows, the evening light had softened into the warm gold of late afternoon, casting long reflections across the skyline and painting the polished surface of the conference table with quiet streaks of sunlight. Ava stood where she had been standing since the conversation began, her posture calm and composed, yet the meaning of Whitmore's words slowly settled across her expression. The housekeeping cart still waited near the door where she had left it earlier, a small reminder of the role she had carried into the room only a short time before. One of the visiting executives leaned back slowly in his chair and let out a quiet breath. $300 million, he said again. But this time the number sounded less like surprise and more like gratitude for the mistake that had been avoided. The senior attorney beside him closed the contract folder completely, signaling that the negotiation had reached a natural pause. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood as he watched Ava carefully. There was no hint of performance in his expression now, only the calm certainty of a decision made after careful thought. Ava finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "That is a generous offer, sir." Whitmore shook his head slightly. "It is not generosity," he replied. "It is recognition." The words carried across the room with quiet clarity. Several of the attorneys nodded subtly, understanding exactly what he meant. Ava lowered her eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of the opportunity that had just been placed in front of her. When she looked up again, there was no excitement in her expression, only thoughtful composure. "If I come back tomorrow," she asked gently, "what would you expect from me?" Whitmore answered without hesitation. "The same thing you gave this room today," he said. "Honesty, clarity, and the courage to speak when something does not make sense." A faint smile touched Ava's face then, small but genuine. Around the table, the executives watched the exchange with quiet approval. The earlier tension had completely disappeared, replaced by something far more respectful. Whitmore glanced briefly toward the window where the last light of the afternoon reflected across the city. Then he returned his attention to Ava. "There is one more thing," he added calmly. "When you walk through the front entrance tomorrow morning, do not bring the housekeeping cart." A few soft smiles appeared around the table. Ava nodded once in understanding. The meeting gradually began to dissolve after that. Attorneys gathered their folders, laptops closed with gentle clicks, and quiet conversations resumed in low voices. Yet the atmosphere in the room had changed in a way that no contract clause could explain. As Ava walked back toward the door, she paused briefly beside the cart she had pushed into the room earlier. For a moment, she rested her hand on the handle, then let it go. Through the tall glass windows, the city lights were beginning to appear one by one as evening settled across the skyline. Ava stepped into the hallway with calm, steady steps, leaving the cart behind her as the door closed softly, and the quiet of the corridor welcomed the beginning of a very different tomorrow.